Fellow Rotarians and guests, it is a great honour to introduce a distinguished individual who's made significant contributions to both our nation and Rotary, Stuart Ellis. A man of remarkable experience and service, has been a true force for positive change. Stuart's journey is a testament to his unwavering commitment to duty and community. With over 22 years of dedicated service in the Australian Army, he served with the renowned SAS Regiment, showcasing his leadership and resilience in the most challenging environments. In 1996, Stuart took on a new challenge, stepping into the role of Chief Officer of the South Australian Country Fire Service, where he demonstrated outstanding leadership during his 5-year tenure. Following this, he established a consultancy company specialising in operational leadership, and his expertise became instrumental in over 20 reviews, including the Canberra Bushfires, the Victorian Bushfire Royal Commission, and the operational response to the Christchurch Earthquake in 2011. In 2012, Stuart was appointed CEO of AFAC, the National Council for Fire and Emergency Services in Australia and New Zealand. In this capacity, he played a pivotal role in coordinating and strengthening fire and emergency services across the region, leaving a lasting impact. Stuart's commitment to Rotary is equally inspiring. He has been a dedicated member of the Rotary Club of Adelaide for a decade, and later served Rotary Club of Melbourne Central for 9 years, and currently Stuart is the president of the Rotary Club of Encounter Bay. A loving husband and father of 2 adult boys, Stuart's passion for service and his remarkable journey are a testament to the Rotary values of service above self. We are truly fortunate to have Stuart as a member of our Rotary community. Please join me in welcoming Stuart Ellis.
Thank you, Duan, for that introduction, and it's a real pleasure to be back here today and to be with the Rotary Club of Adelaide. It's where I was introduced to Rotary, inspired by my uncle, who was a long-term Rotarian, and it's where I learnt about Rotary. And so, I think you've got a wonderful club. And to see Jeff Tate here, the 100, it's very impressive. And to see a lot of familiar faces. I think you've got the most marvellous club, and I really enjoyed the centenary lunch a month or 2 ago. So, talking about a resilient Australia supported by coordinated emergency services. This is the picture of the Stirling Ranges, which you may know if you come from Western Australia. It's where the SAS for a long time have done their selection courses, and you walk over these hills with a heavy pack and an empty stomach, and your motivation is tested. It's in quite difficult heath to walk through. And so at one stage I did find myself geographically embarrassed on the side of a dirt track, a bit like this, and looked down the track, and there was another person on the selection course, seemed to be in a similar position, so I went down and spoke to him. Do you know where we are? And he said, no idea, mate. And so we were trying to work that out, and just at that time a Land Rover came over the hill, and it was an Army Land Rover, and I said, no problem, I'll just step out and stop the driver and ask where we are. So as the vehicle came up, I sort of stepped out onto the road and put my hand up, and the driver slowed down. He didn't actually stop, but he did lean over and wind down his passenger window, and as he was sort of cruising past, I said, "Where are we?" And he called back, "You're on the road," and kept going. And the chap I was with said, "Oh, that I think is the commanding officer. You could say your speaker today." And I said, "Oh, you've met him?" He said, "No, I haven't met him, but what he said was accurate, precise and totally useless." So I guess my challenge today is to be accurate, precise and useful. So we'll try and do that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what is a resilient Australia, about our emergency services nationally, and perhaps end on how we can all make a bit of a contribution there. So I'm talking in the context of natural disasters. I mean, resilience for Australia has lots of dimensions, I guess. You could talk about financial or welfare or lots of different areas, cyber, I suppose, but I'm focusing on natural disasters. And so from that context, it's really about that capability to manage and respond, that holistic approach to how we deal with natural disasters, and not only build back, because building back isn't necessarily the answer in a lot of situations, but I prefer to refer to bounce forward. And we know our children and grandchildren are now, resilience is a pretty commonly used term, and individual resilience. I'm told if someone is assessed as 85% resilient, then they're in a pretty good space. From a national perspective, people measure these things, and from a natural disaster perspective, they tell us that we're around 65% resilient, which isn't really an ideal level of protection. So what we need to appreciate if we're talking about national resilience is there are multiple layers. There's lots of aspects to being nationally resilient, and it will vary from place to place and community to community. But it's about identifying risks, understanding the hazards. In fact, if I just went back to I didn't explain that picture there. That picture there is of Christchurch at the time of the earthquake in 2011. I don't know how familiar people are with Christchurch, but it's a city very much like Adelaide, on a plain with a bit more than the Mount Lofty Ranges behind it, some quite substantial hills behind it. And I spent a couple of months there after the earthquake undertaking a review with some New Zealanders. And I thought earthquakes would these plates that sort of rub next to each other, but this was the vertical lift which causes all the damage. And Christchurch is very much like Adelaide, a lot of stone buildings, and vertical lift of stone buildings does not result in a good outcome. I only mention that because Adelaide is the most earthquake-prone capital city in Australia. So that's about understanding risk. Okay, I'm really uncomfortable about the term prevention. We hear people talking about fire prevention and preventing things, because we can't prevent it. We can't prevent these things. We just need to mitigate against them and plan against them. And so that's where I would focus on. And plan responses, coordinate both at all levels, at community level, at local government, state government, nationally. And we've got to anticipate that the levels of response are going to vary from one place to another. So it is about empowering communities, and I'll talk a bit more about that later on. So I think that's what we're striving for from a resilient Australia perspective. Let me just touch on emergency services in Australia. So as Johan indicated, I was Chief Officer of the CFS here for 5 years. So South Australia has CFS, the MFS, has South Australian SES, it's got national parks firefighters and forestry firefighters. But across Australia there's actually 33 different agencies that are all involved with emergency services, and they're all listed there in the different states and territories. I reflect on that because our Defence Force, I think, is about 75,000, reservists and so on, and here we are in emergency services. We've got 30,000 paid staff and over 200,000 volunteers, and those volunteers are all trained, equipped. You know, if you're unfortunate enough to be involved in a road accident outside Adelaide, it's going to be, very likely, it's going to be a volunteer that's going to help you, who's, you know, butcher, candlestick maker or baker, who becomes a CFS volunteer when you dial 000. So there's a fantastic capability in the country. What we're trying to do more and more is utilise that capability around the country, because it's a state-based capability, and the states pay for it. The states own those capabilities, if you like, but we are striving to use them nationally more and more, including New Zealand. So what people perhaps don't appreciate is that the national government isn't responsible for emergency management in Australia, because it's constitutionally, it doesn't have the powers. We're talking about, you know, referendums and constitutions. That power rests with the states. And probably, if I'm being a little bit cheeky and cynical, the national government doesn't want that responsibility, because often it's not a good news story. So let's leave that with the states. But there is some, you know, there are times, and I'll reflect on those a bit later, when Prime Ministers do want to step forward. They do have this National Emergency Management Agency, which does do a degree of coordination of Commonwealth resources, but they can't direct the states to do anything. And so that national coordination that we're talking about is done by the industry itself, and that's the job that I left Adelaide for and went to Melbourne. That role should probably be in Canberra, but for historical reasons in Melbourne, and that's coordinating those national resources. And so it's bringing together the commissioners and the chief officers to make those decisions about where those resources go, because the chief officer in South Australia says he's happy to move resources to Victoria. It's on him or her if something happens in South Australia and he hasn't got the resources here. So it's not something that they do lightly, and indeed they speak to their ministers about that, but they are significant decisions. We also have a National Rural Firefighting Centre, and I'll talk about that, this National Resource Sharing Centre, because it's about sharing resources, incident management systems, and I'll touch on that, which is an important element to that national work. And we're also trying to place greater emphasis on resilience, so we've got the Resilience Institute. And so we are trying to increase that focus, but probably for most emergency services, probably around 90% of their resources are spent on response and 10% on resilience. So it is an ongoing challenge. With that common incident management system, it's just really the way we manage. It's a bit like how we manage across Rotary. We could go from one Rotary club to another, and we would know how it works because we all, you know, essentially manage the same way. And that's the same with managing fires. And so it means we can pick up management personnel from Perth and fly them to New South Wales, and they can walk straight into managing a fire situation there. Or even more impressively, as we've done this winter, you know, the North American summer sent people across to Canada and the US, and indeed they've supported us, and we can fly them over, they'll have a day's rest, and then they step straight into the role, because we manage these incidents the same way. And that's proven to be a really positive arrangement, but it does take a lot of effort to maintain it. We do have quite a sophisticated command and control system. That's the command centre for the Rural Fire Service in New South Wales. It's probably the largest, it is the largest in the country. And so that's a bit like I've never been in a share market, but it's what I imagine a share market's like, because we've got all these competing demands, fires, incidents around the state, and in that one central location, people bid for those resources and are allocated those resources, and everyone maintains what we refer to as a common operating picture. But it is, you know, there's a lot of sophistication involved. We track every vehicle they've all got vehicle location, automatic vehicle location, and so on. And so we have progressed a long way from the sort of World War II blitz, which volunteer services did have in times past. And we've also got quite a fleet of aircraft which we use every summer, and the organisation that our CEO of, we used to purchase these services. So as you can imagine, it's quite a big contractual arrangement. There's about 180 aircraft that we normally contracted for 3, sometimes 5 years. About 10 of those aircraft are what we call large air tankers, some very large air tankers. And so they are 737s or DC-10s, tend to be, not all, but tend to be older aircraft. But they carry a large amount of water, 10, 15, 18,000 litres of water, and they can do a good job at reducing the risk on the edge of a fire. Very rarely do they put it out, but a lot of those smaller aircraft, a lot of those 165 aircraft are smaller aircraft like we have in South Australia, helicopters and fixed wing, and the notion is as soon as someone sees a fire, particularly in Mount Lofty ranges, those aircraft are up and they head to the fire straight away and try and dump water on it even before crews get there. And that's proven to be a very effective strategy. And we track every aircraft movement just like we track the vehicle movement of firefighting vehicles, and so that helps us work out how effective they are versus the cost. None of these things are cheap. And so we manage that way as well. What pulls us up, and the 1920 summer did exactly that, was when we have these concurrent, compounding and consecutive events. And it's not uncommon for us to be fighting fires in Victoria or New South Wales, and for there to be cyclones in Western Australia or Queensland. And so we've got to identify how best we're going to manage resources and where we reallocate those. And sometimes that works well because they're different resources, and sometimes they're competing. And that becomes more of a challenge for us. But we are the land of droughts and flooding rains, and that tends to dictate, from an emergency management perspective, the experiences that we have. Because that's a picture of the 1920, going into the 1920 summer, and it was pretty evident, we'd been in a 10-year drought, that fires that year were going to have a big impact. Because one of the things we don't talk about, you don't hear a lot about, but we measure very carefully, is what's called soil dryness, the soil dryness index. Because if we know how dry the soils are, we know how stressed the vegetation is and how easily it's going to burn. And the other one, which is sort of that invisible one, is the relative humidity. And if you keep a little tab on relative humidity, if it gets down to the single figures on a hot day, then that tends to be pretty bad news as well, because it means the vegetation is going to burn extremely well. But these, just as we're heading into this summer, it's not at the end of a 10-year drought, so I'm not anticipating we're going to have a season quite like 1920 season, but it's going to be a dry summer. We're pretty clear on that, and that impacts what we have. So there's no question that the duration and intensity of fire seasons are extending. In the eastern states, having fires now in August and September is anticipated, whereas 10, 15 years ago it would be October really before we experienced large fires. So that's just the reality of where we were at. And the irony is, but we're also having more flooding and weather events, and so that's the impact at the other end of the scale. So put those all together, it is pretty challenging. So I thought this might just be of interest, impact-wise. I mean, I've thrown in the pandemic, just because it's sort of in recent memory, I guess. But it's actually heat and floods, because somewhere in Australia, floods kill people every year, largely because people can't resist driving through a flooded causeway and not realising how deep it is and get washed away. And that happens consistently every flood. It's really not a sensible thing to do, so I really discourage you from doing that. Probably not something we face in South Australia too often, thankfully, but just take a deep breath and have a rest on the side of the road, or turn around and take another route would be my advice, because it's a pretty deadly option. And of course, from an insurance perspective, where these events occur has a big impact on the cost. And the hailstorm in Sydney in 1999, because it was Sydney, had a huge insurance impact. Of course, the fires as well. But yeah, the location of those events directly impacts what's going to happen as well. And from a fire perspective, it'd be a bit hard to read that, so let me just explain. The left-hand graph is the size of the fire, so the areas burnt in 1920, by far the most significant areas burnt in recorded history for Australia, whereas the greatest lives lost was 2009 in Victoria, 173 lives in one afternoon. I'll say this carefully, what we saw with a good degree of improvement is, even though a much larger area burnt in 1920, the number of lives lost was actually much smaller. Now, that was, the area burnt was over a number of months, but it was over very populated areas, particularly down the east coast. I know it was in KI and places in the hills as well, but it was over very populated areas. But we feel that the advice we were able to give out and the reception of that advice by communities has significantly improved. And there's social media and telephone messaging and lots of things we do now which help with that. Homes-wise, we still do lose a lot of homes, which is never a very satisfactory outcome, but much better than lives lost. So it's something, if we build homes in fire-prone areas, then we are going to lose them. And of course, politics always play a part. Fortunately, I was in a non-political role, but I had to interface with politics a lot. And I'm not making any judgments here, it's just the reality. Different leaders respond in different ways, and there's different circumstances as well. And communities respond in different ways. And that all plays into the impact of what priority is given to funding and response, and it leads to commentary, such as this, with the cartoon here. And I think my reflection, because I've been involved in a lot of inquiries when I was consulting in particular, my reflection is we're very good at identifying lessons, but we're not so good at implementing them, because that it effectively takes more effort, takes government resources, often multiple government resources from different state and federal governments, and that's far more difficult. So one of the challenges we face is implementing the lessons we've already identified. If I was to sort of try and wrap that up in a quick summary, the more resilient we can become, potentially the less reliant we'll be on emergency services. It's a bit of a truism, but it's how do we impact that? I say that we need to show more initiative at an individual and local community level. When I was involved with that Christchurch review of the operational response to the Christchurch earthquake, we went to Lyttelton, which is the port of Christchurch, but quite isolated. And they were isolated because they had a tunnel to get to Lyttelton, and the tunnel was blocked after the earthquake. And we had this community meeting with a group about this size, and people were talking about, you need to speak to the banker about that. That's a question for the banker. So no one identified themselves as the banker, and so later in the meeting I said, no, you've got to tell me who this banker was. And this quite formidable woman put her hand up, and she had this big leather-bound book under her arm, and she said, I'm the banker. And I said, okay, so you run a bank? She said, no, I bank the time of the community. And this little town of Lyttelton, 3,000 people, had organised themselves long before the earthquake to organise themselves so that if you went and did some babysitting, you didn't get paid, you got 2 or 3 hours credit in her book. Or you went and mowed the lawn for someone, you got an hour's credit. Or you did some painting for someone, you were credited. And they had organised themselves incredibly well. So after the earthquake, I got a bit of speaking to, they said, you're coming with your flashing lights and your government response and so on. We don't need all that. All we need is the support for the community to manage itself well. And they self-managed themselves very well, and they still maintain that book and that banking of time, and it just pulls the community beautifully together. Now they are a little bit isolated, which I think helps as well, but it's a wonderful arrangement, and it was a great illustration, I thought, of local community resilience. And of course, if you're living in the city, you're going to be more resilient potentially than in the country. And in New Zealand, they advocate that everyone in New Zealand should maintain 3 days food and water. Now, probably, most of us have probably got 3 days food in the pantry. For a lot of families, that wouldn't be the case, but we're probably fortunate enough to have that. But we might need to go down to the supermarket and get a couple of slabs of bottled water and keep that in the cupboard and just turn that over every 6 months, and then you've got enough water to survive for 2 or 3 days, even if a water mains breaks. Don't need necessarily to have an earthquake or a natural disaster. So there's little things that we can all do there. And certainly from a council perspective, I am critical of the decisions made to build houses, particularly on floodplains in unsuitable areas, because we know it's going to have a dreadful impact down the track. But it's in the council interest to have more houses built. We know we've got a housing crisis and councils want more rates and so on, but it's an ongoing challenge. But our message is here is provide hope in the world, and I would like to leave you with a message of hope. We are more coordinated. We are focusing more on resilience than we ever have before. So, there is a positive outlook, but we've still got some distance to go. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Stuart. So we are running a little bit over, so we might just take one or two questions before we move on. A question over here.
One question, 2 parts. One, you say the federal government doesn't. You're not a federal government department. You also say that the states are responsible. So, to whom are you responsible? Is it a federal government or the combined state organisations or whatever? Second part, what are the statistics on how fires actually start, apart from arsonists?
So that industry coordinated body I'm responsible, in that role, I'm responsible to that body, not the federal government. So every emergency service contributes to the running of that national coordination. So it's not done by the federal government. Could contribute, but they contribute a very small amount, David. Fires. That's a good question. I think arson is a relatively small amount, and it depends between bushfires and urban fires. But electricity, I think, would probably be the biggest contributor in one form or another. and lightning. Lightning, we have a huge number of lightning strikes. We do get on top of a lot of them, but not all of them. So that would probably be the two most significant causes.
Last question, David.
Oh, thank you, Stuart. You mentioned resilience a lot, and I noticed, I can't remember the name of the guy that was in charge of the New South Wales bushfires, but he was very impressive.
Simmons.
Very impressive fellow, and he went from that role into state resilience or something of that nature. Can you tell us what sort of things he does to promote, or would do to promote resilience?
Well, he's no longer in that role. So that's Shane Fitzsimmons, a good colleague, I know very well. And so he went into that resilience role to try and promote, it's more around that understanding of risk, maintaining building codes, so that where houses are built in high hazard areas, they meet certain requirements, which are more expensive, but that's the cost of living in some of those areas. A lot of it is around promoting community awareness and cohesion. That's probably the priority of that New South Wales, Resilience New South Wales, that body was called.
I'm sorry, I can't say no to Guy.
No, you can't say no to Guy, but as a councillor in Burnside, what do you think we could be doing as a council? Council is important in leading the community for fire prevention. What do you think councils need to concentrate on for fire prevention coming to the summer winter?
For fire prevention, you probably won't like me saying this, Di, but firefighters would actually like to light more fires than they put out. So fuel reduction. Because that's the one thing we can influence directly, and it has a very significant impact on the outcome.
Well, Stuart, thank you very much. And before we give you a warm Rotary thank you, I want to present you with two books. One is our 100 Not Out by Zing, and then the other one is our centenary history book. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed.
So, Rotarians, thank you.